Hey, good morning, and thanks for joining our virtual panel on Thinking Like a Fraudster, Enhancing Fraud Risk Assessment Through Awareness. So I'll start with a quick introduction. So my name is Taylor Larimore, and I'm a senior manager in Grant Thornton's fraud risk mitigation practice. Really excited to be here today. This is actually one of my favorite topics to give trainings on, and hosting a panel discussion should provide some really good insights from the group of panelists we have today. So I just want to quickly set the stage for what we'll be discussing, and then we'll get into some introductions for our three panelists. So when thinking like a fraudster, I always like to kind of set the stage by just explaining, why it's important for an organization to think about. So understanding the types of fraud your agency is vulnerable to is really vital to developing the right anti-fraud activities, right? So thinking like a fraudster, to develop your agency's fraud risk map and build fraud awareness among program and functional area staff is just a really important step to the fraud risk assessment process, right? And so if you think about it, your program staff and functional area staff typically understand the processes, policies, and controls better than anybody else. Yet at the same time, they're also more likely to not be trained in fraud risk assessment techniques and not really understand the specific vulnerabilities and the different elements that make fraud kind of unique in the risk realm. And so that's why it's really important to think like a fraudster, and that's why this approach to risk assessment is so powerful for organizations. So it incorporates training and awareness, building to strengthen your agency's ability to get better information out of your vulnerabilities, about your vulnerabilities to fraud, right? So the objective for the panel today is to provide practical, actionable information that your agency can use to get your staff to think like fraudsters to improve your fraud risk posture. So with that, let's take a look at our three panelists. So Linda Miller is the Deputy Executive Director of the Pandemic Response Accountability Committee. You've probably seen her on some other panels. She's been popular to this conference, but Linda, thanks for joining us. I know you're probably tired of panels, so we really appreciate your insights.
Sure.
Donna Sandoval is the controller for the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico, and was formerly with the state of New Mexico. And then Jack Harbour is a business requirements analyst with the Department of the Treasury, Bureau of the Fiscal Service, and specifically the Payment Integrity Center of Excellence. So with that, I'll turn it over to each of our panelists to just talk for a few minutes about their organization's role in fighting fraud, waste, and abuse. And so Jack, can we start with you and learning a little bit about PICO?
Absolutely, Taylor, thank you. So when we think of PICO, we think of the fraud knowledge that agencies already have, and think of that knowledge that they have as the map of what they're looking at to combat fraud. And think of PICO as the guide that can help them get to that destination with data analytics and resources to guide the agency for ideas in fraud prevention and detection. The Payment Integrity Center of Excellence works with government-wide partnerships with the agencies to issue guidance with objectives of delivering actionable business insights and solutions for agencies, to partner with them in the identification, prevention, and recovery of improper payments. And to do this, there's a few things that we want to go through. We want to take the steps of understanding the business problem. So we want to work with the customers and the agencies to collaborate and understand what the challenge or the need that the agency has may be. And then we want to develop some type of customer-centric solution. So working in an innovative manner to analyze the data and the insights that we have. And then we want to take that analysis and we want to implement a solution. We want to provide actionable results and tangible outcomes that solve some type of operational or business need. And then, of course, we want to be able to measure value. So we do want to evaluate the results and the effectiveness of the process improvements. And then to improve, one of the things that we do is we share our best practices with our stakeholders through training and outreach. And that would be through forums such as this, or when we have outreach through our regional payment associations, or our recent agency partnership engagement, where we partner with agencies to see what their challenges and needs are and what data and information we have that can help them. And then we undertake all of these efforts with the idea in mind that we're all better together, and that by sharing this information, we can be better than the fraudsters and help the agencies beat them as well.
That's great. Thanks, Jack. Appreciate the introduction. Donna, can we go over to you to learn a little bit more about your role at the Controller's Office?
Sure. Good morning. I oversee the accounting division at the City of Albuquerque. We have a staff of 38. We oversee payroll for almost 7,000 employees. We manage payables, receivables, grants, and we prepare the CAFR. You've heard the term of it takes a village. It does take a village. It takes a team to manage the internal control structure for the City of Albuquerque. I oversee just one division in the Department of Finance and Administration. I also work closely with budget, procurement, and those 21 departments at the City of Albuquerque, all those fiscal managers and their staff. There's no way that I could say it could just be my staff or just Department of Finance and Administration to control payroll, whether it's overtime, travel cards, payments to vendors, setting up vendors, controlling overtime. So it definitely takes a team.
Great. Thanks, Donna. And Linda, can we go over to you?
Sure, yeah. And thanks for having me on the panel. As Taylor mentioned, you guys could be sick of me by now. It's my third panel here at the AGA conference. And so I think most may be well initiated by this point about what the pandemic response accountability is. But for those who haven't had a chance to hear from me yet, I think I'm the one that's representing the PRAC here at this conference. The PRAC was created by the CARES Act in April of 2020 to oversee the $2.6 trillion of CARES Act funding. The PRAC is a committee within CIGI, the Council of Inspectors General on Efficiency and Integrity. And so it's made up of 21 inspectors general that got the largest, the largest amount of CARES Act funding. And so our organization is designed, we've organized the PRAC around three primary objectives. One is transparency, which is a really big part of our mission, which is to make sure that the public at large knows where the money is going. We've achieved that mission, the first step of that mission, by launching a website. We were mandated to launch a website within 30 days of enactment, and we were able to do that largely with the help of the Postal Service Inspector General. But we just launched version 2.0 of our website about 2 weeks ago. And I really encourage everyone to go visit pandemicoversight.gov, where we have a lot of great information on where the CARES Act funding is going. And you can search it in a variety of different ways to see how that money is being spent. And we anticipate building out that website quite a bit more over the next years, to include more usability for the public, to be able to do kind of your own analysis and looking at how that money is being spent. We have another directorate within PRAC is about outreach and engagement. We think it's really important to communicate with the public and our various stakeholders to help them understand how oversight is being conducted of that $2.6 trillion. And then our third and final directorate is what you might think of as a typical Inspector General office. It's the oversight and accountability function. We will be doing some of our own audits. We've just launched one recently that we're looking at CARES Act contracts where the vendor was both a first-time vendor to the government and it was a sole source contract. A lot of the work we're going to be doing is data-driven, so we're building an analytics capability with a large engine and some advanced capabilities that will allow us to draw conclusions using data to provide insight into where fraud may be occurring. And so that's really what the PRAC is and how we intend to carry out our statutory authority to help oversee the $2.6 trillion in CARES Act spending.
Great. Thanks, Linda.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So why don't we move into our first kind of discussion question. And so the first topic I really want to focus on in the discussion here is looking at the AntiFraud Playbook that Treasury published a couple years ago. As I think, that's where this Think Like a Fraudster idea really started. And so the playbook has been characterized as kind of the GPS unit to help agencies find their way when standing up fraud risk programs that align to GAO's fraud risk framework. And so with that in mind, Jack, I was hoping that you could provide some background on the AntiFraud Playbook and talk about how Play 5, Think Like a Fraudster, can help agencies build a more fraud-aware culture and help with their fraud risk assessment process.
Yeah, definitely, Taylor. The AntiFraud Playbook, I mean, being co-issued by the CFO Council and the Fiscal Service, it's broken down into 4 phases. And I think that between that and then the 16 various plays that you have within the various phases, that's helpful for the agencies because you can pick and choose where your agency wants to start. So if play 5, maybe when you're first looking at the anti-fraud playbook, is applicable to your agency, you could skip over 1 through 4 if you feel that you already have that fraud aware culture and move on to play 5. And then play 5 of the anti-fraud playbook, that is a fantastic tool for agencies to build a more fraud-aware culture and identify risk. And I like the analogy that you used of being like the GPS that can help agencies get to their destinations. And what I think we need to encourage agencies to think of when they're thinking of play 5 is not to think in terms of what they would do, but think of the schemes that could be utilized by people that are intent on defrauding their agency to commit that fraud. And so this is something with the anti-fraud playbook where Fiscal Service has been a part of pilots and conducted workshops on this, where when we first reached out to an agency and we went over what type of risk they thought that they were facing, they really didn't think that there was much that they were at risk with. But when we started to ask questions and we started that brainstorming session with the group saying, well, if you were going to defraud this program, what might you do? Or what if we did this? Well, then that's when those questions started to come out. Oh, well, you're right. And if something happened along that line of business, then, this could take place. And that environment just kind of fed on itself. So I think then when you have encouraged that deep look at how you, with that knowledge, could think that if you were going to think like a fraudster, what you would do to defraud your agency, you can go back with that information then and address those risks. But all of this only takes place when you're willing to get together and do that and think like a fraudster. So it's important that there is that mindset of, oh, well, I wouldn't attempt to do that, or people I know wouldn't attempt to do that. You have to try to get that mindset of what somebody would do that is intent on defrauding your agency.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so, Linda, you were one of the authors of the Fraud Risk Management Framework, right? And the playbook really hopes to help agencies have that kind of practical guide for implementing the framework. So can you talk about how the AntiFraud Playbook can specifically play 5 align to the GAO framework and the 4 components there?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when I was back at GAO and we were writing the GAO fraud framework, the big impetus was that when we would talk to agencies about fraud, I was in the forensic investigations and audits team. So our team looked at sort of fraud writ large across the government. And we always get the same response from agencies, which was, well, that's the responsibility of the IG. So if you're interested in fraud, go talk to the IG. That's not our area. And we knew, that there was problems there, because if there's not a focus on ensuring that money is getting to the intended recipient, it's just getting money out the door. If you see that as your mission, you don't see your mission as as safeguarding those funds from fraud, waste, and abuse, that's a problem. And we were seeing it as a problem across government. So when we wrote the playbook, the focus was the Fraud Risk Management Framework. We wanted agencies to start thinking about their role as being a more skeptical, taking a more skeptical posture and considering the possibility that a beneficiary was not, in fact, an eligible beneficiary. And so think like a fraudster play really ties well into the whole fraud risk assessment and the fraud risk management culture that the GAO fraud framework encourages agencies to think about. So brainstorming is one of the things within the GAO fraud framework that's considered a leading practice. Brainstorming fraud risks. And I know that one of the things that this fraud risk example that we have on the slide right now is really trying to get people to think more creatively about, like Jack was saying, not what you do, but what a fraudster might do. And too often we like to think the best of everyone, which is nice and a positive thing. But the fact is, that not everybody is exactly who they say they are. They don't all have the best intentions. And, so when you're doing a fraud risk assessment activity like this, like trying to think like the fraudster mind, you have to create a lot more skepticism in your own mind about, well, what if this person isn't who they say they are? What if, and then fill in the blank. What if they're trying to, they've stolen someone's identity? What if they are using the beneficiary's computer and they're pretending to be the beneficiary, but they're really a friend or a family member? What if, you have to start to think about what are the possibilities that this person might not be who they say they are. And these activities, these fraud risk management brainstorming activities and getting into the mind of the fraudster are really exactly what GAO's fraud framework had in mind when it wanted agencies to start to take a more proactive view about fraud and their risks to it.
Yeah, that's great. And so, Linda, when you look at the risk map we're looking at here for thinking like a fraudster, it lays out the different schemes related to the actors that would commit those schemes and the actual fraud risk entry points. So for that, I see payroll records, timesheets, payroll system. Maybe there's social engineering going on through a call center. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of thinking about the actor and the channel through which that fraud would be committed in light of thinking like a fraudster?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the importance of considering when you're going through an exercise where you're trying to understand what are all the ways that fraud could be occurring within my agency. We sometimes don't get very creative when we think about it. So this activity will help you think about. So if you're thinking about just about payroll fraud, how many different ways can payroll fraud happen, and how many different people could be involved in a payroll scheme? And that's what this example is trying to show. It's, you might think, oh, padding your timesheet, that's payroll fraud. That's all I've ever thought about when I thought about payroll fraud, is somebody padding their timesheet. But what if you were actually, creating a collusive fraud relationship between you and the payroll manager? And what if you were paying that person off to change the payroll records prior to paychecks being cut? What if that was a control environment within your agency that was enabled that to happen? What if someone within the payroll office creates ghost employees, and when people leave the agency, they don't actually remove them from the payroll records? They just change their bank account information to the payroll officer's bank account information and have their paychecks now delivered to the payroll offices. And frequently when we do these kinds of activities with agencies, they'll look at you like you're crazy. Like, someone would really do that? And it's like, not only would someone do that, someone's done that in almost every federal agency and almost every organization in the United States. People do it because they have the opportunity to do it and because they can get away with it, right? And so the key is to stop thinking, so like, I wouldn't do it, so that means how could anyone else possibly do it? But wow, okay, people do this, and we need to be thinking about whether we have controls in place to ensure that doesn't happen. And I think that's what we really need to get. That professional skepticism really has to increase, and this is a great way for people to start to build that professional skepticism more. Yeah,
that's a great point. And you started to hit on it a little bit, but the fraud triangle is really important when thinking about and identifying fraud risks, right? And thinking about an organization's vulnerabilities. And so, Jack, I know the AntiFraud Playbook talks about the fraud triangle. Do you want to expand on that a little bit and talk about why that's important when thinking about an organization's fraud risks?
Absolutely. And I think I'll be copying Linda's phrase of that professional skepticism there, like some people steal memes. I love that. And I can't encourage that enough, because I think that when we think of the fraud triangle, we think of the opportunity that somebody has. We think of the rationalization that they'll make for, taking advantage of that opportunity. And then what's their motivation or the pressure that might push them to do that? And in the current environment of the pandemic, it certainly creates an atmosphere for a fraudster to act. And not only are the same opportunities there that have always been there, but I mean, we have new opportunities that have become available because we had the stimulus, we had the extra unemployment that individuals were entitled to. And I mean, even just with like the unemployment, the extra $600 a week, you could think of a situation where maybe somebody had the opportunity to go back to work and they were offered work, but they chose not to go back. I mean, technically that's fraudulent because they should have taken the unemployment or the employment opportunity, but they've chosen to continue to receive that extra $600 a week along with their unemployment. And because of the pandemic, that rationalization and motivation segment of the triangle, you could think has arguably increased by an order of magnitude, because you might have somebody that, instead of looking at committing fraud, like with Linda's example in the payroll, where maybe they're just looking to commit fraud to obtain funds, but now you might have somebody who's committing fraud because of medical bills, or maybe to combat, losing their home or something of that nature. And you're going to run into the rationalization of, well, I should get my fair share. I pay taxes, and it's not my fault I'm out of work. The government shut down my job, so it should be okay that I do this. It's an emergency. Why is this a bad thing? And, when somebody's not able to pay their bills, it might be something that they would do. And so I really think to have that skepticism and take a look at it, that's truly something in this pandemic, because of how that's, I almost would say, enhancing the fraud triangle, be something that we need to take a look at. And now would be the time for the agencies to get together and brainstorm about that. Different lines of businesses get together and collaborate as part of this and come up with ideas of how one, would attempt to defraud their own agency. Going back to, like Linda was saying, you just think of, padding your timesheet, but look at all the other opportunities that might exist. Don't treat fraud like a 4-letter word, like some people want to. Talk about it, get it out in the open so that everybody can share their ideas about it.
Yeah, I really like that. Fraud is not a 4-letter word play. It's good. Donna, we haven't heard from you in a couple minutes here. So thinking about the AntiFraud Playbook, right? It was really written with federal government requirements in mind, but the concepts and principles are easily transferable to other levels of government, and it even says that up front in the document, right? So at your experience at the city and at the state level, how do you think that this play in particular, and the AntiFraud Playbook more generally, applies to city and state governments, and how you're identifying and assessing your fraud risks?
Sure, it definitely applies to state and local government. When I saw those 4 stages, I tried to think of controls that we have in place at the city that would help prevent or put controls into place. First, culture. I'm sure most state agencies and local government have a code of conduct. The city, sure, you have to sign that you've read the code of conduct when you get hired, but we also have an annual refresher training. We've also put things into place like administrative instructions, limiting small purchase, approval of purchase orders, payments, and then there's monthly and annual controls that we have in place. In accounting, when we prepare trial balances, it's reviewing expense items. If there's large increases, why? Budget does the same thing with budget projections. We brought up payroll. Working together with budget. If you have vacancies in a division and you're looking at expenses and certain line items, and you're not seeing a decrease and you have vacancies, there's a problem. Look into that. We report to City Council. We report to Finance and Government Operations. It's a subcommittee of City Council, Public Safety Committee. We report on revenues, expenses, CAFR, or any annual audit findings that we have. And I'm going to think most state agencies and local governments are going to say, if you work on the financial operations side, probably don't have time to do a risk assessment. We don't. But I don't like audit findings. I don't think anybody does, but I find it as an opportunity for improvement. That's why any controls that we have in place, it's supplemented, right, by internal audit, state auditor's office, annual audit. This is not a secret. This is on the state auditor's website. They issue letters of concern if they get tips. We are on there for a couple of items. One of them had to do with travel. One of the city councilors' travel was under question. I had to write a response to it. We had to return She had to return money to the city that did not follow our travel regulations. I just finished revising the travel regulations that would help plug those holes where there could be misunderstandings, and also put accountability on those fiscal managers, whether it's city council or some other city department. If you're approving something, that means you understand what the requirements, what the regulations are, and you are approving them, understanding that. We also, now that we can't have classroom training, we prepared a training video on travel. It should be ready here in the next couple of weeks. So you need to take this annually as a refresher course. You know, if you have staff turnover, sometimes even if you don't have staff turnover, so people need to be reminded. These are the regulations. I didn't get caught on this, so nobody asked me. And not that they're trying to commit fraud. They just approved something that shouldn't have been approved, and they weren't questioned about it.
Yeah, it's a good reminder of the importance of having that fraud risk aware culture, right? And the importance of those trainings, because if you don't have the resources to do a full fraud risk assessment, you can at least make sure that your organization is aware of those tip lines and what to do if they see something that, you know, is fraudulent, or even if it's, you know, just waste or abuse, right? Like it's still important. It's still protecting taxpayer funds. And so those tips came through, you investigated, you changed your policies, now you're doing more training, so you're shoring up those vulnerabilities. So that's great. That's a great example. Thank you. And so kind of changing topics a little bit, you know, we can't go a full 50 minutes without talking about the pandemic, of course. And Jack, you started to hit on this a little bit, talking about the fraud triangle and how those dynamics are changing just due to the increased opportunity with all the additional stimulus funds going out, the increased pressure on families to pay their mortgages, pay medical bills, pay for school, maybe pay for tutors if their kids can't even go to school, right? Thinking about just the new dynamic and the new environment as it relates to fraud, waste, and abuse. Linda, can you maybe talk a little bit about some of the new fraud schemes and trends that you're seeing in the new environment, and then your role in the PRAC, and how agencies can really utilize the Think Like a Fraudster approach to enhance their fraud readiness based on what you've seen at the PRAC?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, do we have a slide that shows these? Yeah. So, you know, in a word, it's data. That's the biggest change. Last time we put out a stimulus of any, well, we've never put out a stimulus of the magnitude we just put out. Biggest stimulus we put out prior to this was $800 billion. This is 2.6 trillion. It's 3 times as much, 5 times as much. Yesterday in the plenary session, Inspector General Horowitz made the statement that even if 99% of every dollar spent in the CARES Act was spent correctly, and there was only 1% of fraud, waste, abuse, that would represent the entire budget of the Department of Justice. So, you know, when we're thinking about the numbers, it's insane, right? So there's enormous amounts of dollars and enormous amounts of potential fraud. And the biggest issue that we face is there's been gigantic hacks in the last 10 years. Pretty much everybody's data is available for sale on the dark web now. There's just been there's such rampant identity theft. And so you've got this issue with this enormous amount of increased data vulnerability. So here on this slide, we're talking about some of the things that we're seeing from people working from home, right? So insider threats, which you normally think of as, you know, sort of sophisticated bad guys that have infiltrated your system. Now we're thinking about just the insider threat from your employee who may be strapped because a family member maybe lost their job and they're feeling an increased amount of pressure. Now have access to all of your organization's data, which they could, if they wanted to, make available for sale on the dark web, and they could make a profit themselves. So the insider threat has become just, you know, any individual staff person with access to the dark web and an incentive to sell information from their organization, increasing susceptibility to hacking. I think that there have been alerts that have seen how many more phishing attempts there have been. It's insane. It's just like this absolute order of magnitude increase in phishing schemes. So you've got people working from home who maybe aren't as they aren't being made aware by their IT systems about some of the phishing schemes that are out there, and so they're more likely to click on a link in an email than they might otherwise have been. And there's a whole lot more emails with a whole lot more links to click on. So and then IT systems that are vulnerable. So this situation creates an enormous opportunity for fraud to occur in this telework environment that we're in. Is one big area. And then I think on the next slide we talk a little bit about some of the data challenges. And I think what we're learning is just that there's an awful lot of what we're seeing in the fraud schemes that are happening right now are, a lot of identity theft. Like I mentioned, I was just in a panel on the last session with the SBA inspector, head of inspections at the SBA, and he was saying that they've got 500 cases they're working right now just on payroll protection program fraud, and he thinks about half of them, anecdotally, he feels about half of them involved identity theft. The problem with that is that we're not going to get that money back. Those individuals have stolen the money with a fake ID, and there's no way to find them. And so we used to say in the pay and chase world that you'd recover 50 cents on every dollar that we lost, by through investigations, through oversight, but we're not going to be able to get the money back that's stolen through identity theft. So we've got some significant challenges with the vast number of data breaches. And I think the story here for the agencies is this is not something that the oversight community is going to be able to manage. It's going to be on the agencies to do a better job of verifying people's identities and putting in place technologies that the private sector have to make sure that the individual who's applying for a benefit is in fact that individual and is not someone who has stolen or created a synthetic ID. That's just absolutely vital. I mean, I think I want to say that in as many forums and as many opportunities as I possibly can, because the challenge here is that the banks and the financial institutions are prepared. They have a lot of tools in place to identify when somebody's identity is not accurate, but in the government, we're still very much taking people's word for it. If you hear sometimes even an internal control in a federal agency is, well, I verified their identity. Well, how did you do that? Well, I asked them for their social security number and they gave it to me. And literally, I mean, this we've seen over and over again. That's considered by many people to be identity verification. They're not even checking it. They're just, is it 9 digits? Okay, I got your, and it's just, I mean, it's just that people don't know. They just don't know how unbelievably vulnerable they are to people having stolen identities. And we need to up our game as a government agencies to really get better at that.
Linda, are there approaches out there or technologies that can help organizations kind of get better insight into their fraud risks and what data is out there on the dark web and the deep web that might put them at risk for fraud?
There are technologies. There's an awful lot of groups now, organizations every day. There's companies that are on the dark web. We've got the good guys on the dark web monitoring the bad guys, and a bunch of companies that are out there doing that work. Looking at how your organization is vulnerable to threat actors on not just the dark web, but also it's interesting. The dark web people think of and nefarious, it's dark, it's bad, and it is, it's all that. And it's pretty small, but there's a big part of what we call just like the normal web, the open web. Anything that's not indexed is considered like open source intelligence. A very small percentage of the actual internet that we're all engaging in is indexed by Google. So tweets and Facebook posts, all your social media interactions, those things are not indexed by Google. But there's a lot of information, there's a lot of data. And so what we call that is open source intelligence. That's on the open web. It's not the dark web, but it's also intelligence that can be scraped and pulled to understand, is there nefarious activity going on that's not even happening on the dark web? It's just happening on the open web that agencies are unaware of. So there are lots of entities now that are out there patrolling those forums, and agencies would be wise to start to use them like the private sector is using them.
Be a little more proactive. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's good to know there are some good guys out there.
Yeah.
That's a little reassurance. So Donna, I'm curious, with a lot of this money going to local and state governments from the stimulus, are you starting to see any new schemes or trends related to fraud at your level?
I don't have anything specific that our biggest risk is probably trying to meet the challenges of ongoing just operations and staff turnover and meeting the reporting requirements for COVID and CARES. It can be challenging. We're still almost complete with reclassification entries for March through June, working with 21 departments and saying, okay, that doesn't really meet the requirements for those. And then getting the supporting documentation. And I also mentioned staff turnover. I'm one of the new kids. I started July 6th with the city. I have more than 25 years with state government, but staff turnover is a risk also. I also lost one of my associate controllers. I hope it wasn't because of me. He gave like 1 day's notice. So we were able to get somebody that had worked in accounting for several years to come in and help us with a CAFR. But I think juggling just the overall financial operations, meeting those deadlines has been the biggest risk for us. And, we talked about payroll earlier. Doing journal entries for payroll for any of these COVID or CARES, boy, you have to have review, and more review, right? We have an outside timekeeping system that gets interfaced to our human resources and accounting system. We found people, timekeepers, that weren't putting it into the timekeeping system. They were correcting staff's time directly into human resources. Unfortunately, it was only picking up hourly. It wasn't picking up any of the fringe benefits. So correcting things like that, that's a risk. I don't think it's not intentional. It's not a fraud, but it just adds more to the workload.
Yeah, and that's definitely what we don't need right now. So Jack, you were talking a little bit earlier about how the fraud triangle's changed, the dynamic has changed with relation to the opportunities and the pressures out there. Can you talk a little bit about, PICO's role in working with different agencies and just how you are able to get them to think about fraud risks more openly and talk about those risks and acknowledge that they exist so that you can actually work with them to make some changes to their controls?
Yeah, absolutely. And it touches on a couple of things Donna and Linda spoke about with like the new risks that Donna was saying that have arisen, and Linda, when she touched on like the identity verification or the synthetic identities. We've partnered with a couple of agencies recently. With one of the agencies, we were partnering with them because they were seeking to issue payments to individuals in need of assistance. And so when we worked with them, we came up with the idea that by working with all of our agency partners, the agency that was issuing the payments, they'd identify the population of these needs-based emergency payments that they were issuing. And they'd provide that information to us at Treasury. Then what we were doing is we were taking that and bumping that up against the universe of data that we have, issuing the government payments to determine had any other federal agencies made payments to this same individual. And when we mean that, we're saying that they pay the same individual to the same bank to the same account. Because then when we would find that match, we could let the agency know either, yes, we found that there was a match here, or no, there wasn't. And they could then take that as part of their process to prioritize their screening of the applications and the payments that were going out, and use that data as an effort to thwart any individuals that were seeking to commit fraud in that case. And kind of on the other end of that, where Linda was like talking about the pay and chase, here we're trying to be ahead of it, but then also on the pay and chase side, which nobody really wants to be on, we partnered with another agency. And there, the goal was to help them analyze the ACH returns of fraudulent payments. So any electronic payments that went out to bank accounts that were coming back electronically. And so what we did there is we worked with the agency, we worked with the financial institutions, we worked with the regional payment associations, NACHA, the Federal Reserve, And we came up with a specific return code that exists that Treasury could utilize for a separate reason. So when we had financial institutions that had identified suspicious transactions or transactions that they had confirmed were fraudulent, they could use this return code to send these payments back to us. We could in turn then pass that information on to the agency, and the agency was able to take that information then, and they could incorporate that into the filters that they already had by looking at what they were receiving back and being able to go back and look at the process that got them to the point of issuing that payment that was identified as fraudulent, so that they can then roll this out in the future to be something that can be on the preventative side, so that we're not on the pay and chase. So that's just kind of an example of where we can leverage our relationship with the financial institutions, the regional payment associations, and the agencies to help them migrate to that side where we can try to get ahead of these folks that are out there trying to defraud us.
Yeah, that's a really great point. That feedback loop that you're talking about is really important, and I think a lot of agencies kind of forget about that. Like after you've identified a fraud or a vulnerability that's been exploited, even if it's not actually prosecuted as fraud, a lot of times agencies don't go back and fix the issue or address the accounts, the beneficiaries that were affected and close those control gaps. Linda, I'm curious, in your role at the PRAC, are you all working with, you're obviously working with inspectors general across government, but how are you all addressing that feedback loop to try to get agencies to be more proactive in fixing those gaps, those control gaps, so that they can address those vulnerabilities that have already been exploited?
I think one of our big goals when we get our analytics capability up and running is to be able to identify patterns and trends. I mean, the nice thing that we'll be able to have is a whole bunch of data. There's 600 million records that we've gotten just in the first tranche of data on the CARES Act spending. We're going to be getting a lot more data. That with that large amount of data, we can really look across and look for big trends and patterns that cross agencies. And I think that's a value that we're going to be able to provide, not just, will be leads and referrals to the inspector general community, but to those agencies to understand, here's what we're seeing. These are the kinds of trends and patterns we're seeing that are representing fraud in these different programs. And there's so much similarity. Often it's the same actors creating, that are defrauding multiple programs. So, if we're seeing trends in obviously the same IP addresses, we know it's the same person. If we're looking at different demographic information or geographic information that can help us narrow down and identify fraud rings, that would help the IG community, but also would help the agencies understand where there may be control weaknesses. Sometimes we see, there could be a field office or a set of field offices within a federal agency that are especially vulnerable for some reason. And why is that? And can we identify those trends and patterns that can help them shore up the controls that might be lacking that they were unaware of? I think there's an awful lot data can tell us if we have the opportunity to really look at it and mine it for what's happening. And so that's one of the ways that we hope the lesson learned will get into the agency management side of the house and not stay over in the oversight community, because again, we're in the pay and chase business, and that's not an effective fraud risk management posture. The agencies are the ones that have the ability to manage the risks to fraud, and it's their responsibility. And we talked about this a bunch in the last panel, being more incentivized. We really need to do a better job of incentivizing program managers to look for fraud and to make sure that before they're putting a payment out, they're doing some level of due diligence to ensure that the payment is going to the right person, which is all about what Jack's program, the Center of Excellence, is intended to do. We want to get more agencies using programs like the Center of Excellence. We want to get them thinking more proactively about the possibility that fraud exists in their programs before they start sending money out the door. So that's one of the ways we hope the PRAC can help.
Yeah, that's a great point. So with that, I want to shift over in the last 5 minutes we have to look at some of the Q&A from the audience. There are quite a few questions popping up, and I think some of them are pretty good and really help drive home some of the points we've been making. around culture and the importance of just fraud awareness in an organization. So the top question on here is, if it's most critical, or if the most critical area is tone at the top, how does one audit the tone? And Don, I was thinking this would be an interesting question for you, as kind of being the top of the organization in Albuquerque there. How do you feel? How is tone at the top important? How do you try to set that tone? And then how does the organization kind of evaluate that on an ongoing basis to see how it's how it's impacting the organization's fraud awareness and readiness for fraud?
I've been at the city for about 3 months, and it's always when you come in from the outside, well, we should be doing this, we should be doing that. And I do. I have a list of things already. One of them is to work more closely with those 21 city departments. We have monthly fiscal manager meetings, but I think it takes more than that. Sometimes, and sure, we're on Zoom, we're in a virtual environment right now. But I think even if we were in a classroom setting, a lot of people don't speak up. So following up individually with them and knowing that we're going to hold them accountable for managing the finances for that department. Also setting tone from the top. I just drafted an administrative instruction. I came from several state agencies in New Mexico. The Department of Finance and Administration in New Mexico has something called an annual certification for each agency. The director or cabinet secretary has to name somebody to be responsible for the accounting function for that agency. It's renewed every year. They need to meet the qualifications, and they need to take required trainings, if it's 4 or 5. And that's meaning to put those controls in place in procurement, in budget, in accounting, in helping us prepare the CAFR, in getting support for our grants, to making sure that our drawdowns on our grants are accurate, for payroll, overtime. And when you're on the operations side, there's a lot of deadlines. and I've told you, I don't see internal audit or state auditor letters of concern as a threat. I see it as an opportunity for improvement. Also, a letter of concern that we received is overtime at the police department. We've known it's an issue. We just asked for bids. We're going to have a firm come in and take a look and give us some recommendations so we can put into place. We also have an inspector general at the city of Albuquerque. On the website, there's a tip line, and it talks about employee confidentiality. If you see fraud, if you see something, you're not going to get in trouble. You need to speak up and say something. I also talked about employee turnover. One of the things that I saw, and I've communicated with my accounting group and the other division directors in my department, is we need to build more knowledge in accounting. Right now, because I walked in and there's not time, I'm doing the analysis and journal entries for all the GASB pronouncements. And if you work for state or local government, there's probably 5 or 6 of them. I don't have a problem doing them, but there's no review function. The review function goes away. So we need to build more knowledge. I think that also builds a culture. And also just a positive work environment. I think that's a tone from the top, that we want to keep employees working in a happy and safe environment, and also protect the city's finances.
Yeah, that's a great message to end on, especially in the current times. One last quick question, Linda. This may be good for you. So the framework, the GAO framework, was issued back in 2015, which is already 5 years ago. Do you know if there are any plans to update the framework?
Yeah, I think GAO is in the process of updating the framework. I don't know that I have a time frame set that I can share right now, but I do believe that they are updating the framework as we speak.
Okay. All right. That's good to know.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, we are just about to wrap up. It's 11:20 right now. So I just want to end by thanking our wonderful panelists. Thank you so much for giving us your time and your insights today, and to AGA for setting up this awesome virtual conference, and then for the audience for your attention and for tuning in. So thank you. And you guys are the fraud fighters on the front lines. So hopefully this was a helpful session for you today, and we'll see you in soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.